I hope you enjoy this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. I also want to thank the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being for sponsoring this course, and you can check that school out at divineinfinitebeing.com. Pope Pius XII. Singularity equals hands of God. So now we're on the concept of intelligent design, the illusion of intelligent design. It's noteworthy that the Pope in 1951 said that the Big Bang Theory is evidence of a creator God. In 1927, the Jesuit priest Georges Lemaitre discovered that general relativity indicates that the universe is expanding, which means it was born from a point of infinite density in the past, the primeval atom. In 1951, Pope Pius called that discovery a proof for God's existence. So here's a quote from the Pope. In fact, it would seem that present-day science, with one sweeping step back across millions of centuries, has succeeded in bearing witness to that primordial fiat lux, uttered at the moment when, along with matter, there burst forth from nothing a sea of light and radiation. Fiat lux, let there be light. Continuing with Pope Pius XII's quote, thus, with that concreteness which is characteristic of physical proofs, it is confirmed the contingency of the universe and also the well-founded deduction as to the epoch when the cosmos came forth from the hands of the Creator. So it came from the proofs for the existence of God. This was an article entitled The Proofs for the Existence of God in the Light of Modern Natural Science, address of Pope Pius XII to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, November 22, 1951. This proclamation from the Pope led a lot of physicists, including Stephen Hawking, to reject the idea of the gravitational singularity, because it does seem that the gravitational singularity has a lot of parallels with the idea of the Creator God. Therefore, those physicists who are atheists began to question whether there really is a gravitational singularity, because they had already decided that there is no God. Hawking flip-flops on infinity, wave function of the universe. So that subtitle, Hawking who was at first a champion of the idea of the gravitational singularity starting in 1965, changed his mind, I believe after he heard about Pope Pius XII's claim that the singularity is like the hands of God. He says, the singularity, if it follows quantum mechanics, is also a wave of probability. So there's no ultimate point of infinite density. There's only a wave function of the universe. And that gives rise to his version of the multiverse theory. Each one of the points in that initial wave of probability of the original singularity pops out into a parallel universe. At any rate, he tries to do away with the point particle of infinite density because it reminds people, including the Pope, of God. So let me just read what Hawking wrote in his famous book, A Brief History of Time. Many people do not like the idea that time has a beginning, probably because it smacks of divine intervention. The Catholic Church, on the other hand, seized on the Big Bang model and in 1951 officially pronounced it to be in accordance with the Bible. There were therefore a number of attempts to avoid the conclusion that there had been a Big Bang. Notice he says there were therefore attempts to disregard the Big Bang theory. Therefore, because the Pope said the Big Bang theory is in accordance with the Bible, therefore atheistic physicists tried to reject the Big Bang theory. They weren't doing it for scientific reasons, they were explicitly reacting theologically. Continuing here later in A Brief History of Time, Hawking says, it is perhaps ironic that, having changed my mind, I am now trying to convince other physicists that there was in fact no singularity at the beginning of the universe. As we shall see later, it can disappear once quantum effects are taken into account. So he says at the quantum scale, the so-called point of infinite gravity would actually be a wave of probability, the wave function of the universe. In exchange for a point of infinite gravity, Hawking gains an infinite set of parallel universes, one for each point in the original wave of probability. Infinities abound everywhere, the hydra of physics, like the heads of a hydra. So a hydra is a mythological creature, a many-headed snake, and if you cut off one of its heads, then two more would pop up in its place. Like the heads of a hydra, it appears that whenever physicists succeed in cutting off infinity in one corner of space-time, it regenerates itself by an exponent of itself elsewhere. To refute Newton's theory of the infinite speed of gravity, Einstein created general relativity, which led to Schwarzschild's point of infinite gravity, which is equivalent to infinite acceleration. To refute quantum theory, Einstein predicted the infinite speed of quantum entanglement, which he thought would show that quantum theory is impossible, but nevertheless has been experimentally confirmed many times. As Kaku said, when physicists try to combine quantum theory with general relativity, the theory of gravity, they get an infinite sequence of infinities, which he said is infinitely worse than the infinite amount of energy predicted to be in the quantum vacuum, according to the synthesis of quantum theory and special relativity. The point here is that infinities, physicists don't like infinities because it makes the predictive value of their equations go out the window. It renders them useless. Also, things like infinite power seems theological. It seems like God. At infinite speed, you're outside of space and time. You're entering the mystic realm of God, as the Pope himself pointed out, and that caused a lot of physicists to reject the whole idea of the Big Bang and the idea of infinite power in general. Nevertheless, every time they try to cut off infinity somewhere, it pops back up even worse than before. So infinities seem to be everywhere at every single point of the quantum vacuum, which underlies every point of three-dimensional space, as well as in the center of every black hole, in the center of the universe itself from the ongoing Big Bang, and at each point of the horizon of the cosmos. And the center of a universe and the horizon are relative terms. If you're out at the horizon, you'd think you're in the center, and that what we perceive to be the center is out at the horizon. The point is, infinities are everywhere. If a point of infinite density is the soul, is the psyche, is the supreme soul who contains all subordinate psyches, then God is everywhere. Consciousness is everywhere. God is omnicentric, and the mathematics indicates that is the case. But the physicists, it's the worst possible nightmare for them. For an atheistic physicist like Michio Kaku, who's a great educator, and he provides a lot for the evolution of human thought, nevertheless, for him that's a nervous breakdown for physics. It's the worst nightmare you could imagine. As I mentioned before, for a theist like me, it's a dream come true. The mathematical science that started with Plato's Academy has brought us full circle back to what Plato was originally saying. Everything originates from the idea of the good, a point of infinite light and infinite consciousness, which I'm equating with the gravitational singularity. The identity of indiscernibles. All singularities are the same. So, in this history of physics, of the concept of the gravitational singularity, we're taking a break and entering into theology for a moment before we move on to string theory, which has its own insights into the gravitational singularity. But even from what we've gathered so far, going over the history of special relativity and general relativity and quantum mechanics, I think it's a good point in the class to point out Leibniz's fundamental postulate of the identity of indiscernibles. So Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the theologian and mathematician who independently co-discovered calculus, developed a philosophical principle called the identity of indiscernibles. If no difference can be discerned between things, they are identical. The Big Bang universe and every black hole within it are structurally identical, a dimensionless point surrounded by a two-dimensional sphere, the surface of a three-dimensional ball. Even though black holes appear at different points in space and time within the universe, because the singularity and its horizon are places where space and time stop, they cannot be differentiated according to spatial or temporal references. So I first read about this application of Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles to gravitational singularities by reading an article by Robert Bruce Ware, a philosophy professor who's also a mathematician. He pointed this out to me, and it is incredibly pertinent for the equation psyche equals singularity. If all singularities are the same, then so are all psyches. We're also all simultaneously unique personalities, as I've discussed before, and will continuously discuss throughout this class. The Gaudiya Vaishnava School of Vedanta has a slogan for that: Achintya Beta Beta Tattva, inconceivably, simultaneously one and different. But the oneness of every soul, the reflection of that philosophical psychological reality, is the oneness. The reflection of that in the realm of physics is the oneness, the indiscernibility between all gravitational singularities. And remember, singularities appear to be everywhere, as we discussed in the previous slide. So everything you can see and all of the universes that you can imagine, they're all rooted in and surrounded by gravitational singularities. That's the omnicentric, the omnipresence of God, but God is also always the center from God's perspective, or from each of our perspectives, because we're part and parcels of God. We're always in the center of an expanding universe, but we're also all one with each other. We talked about the theory of quantum entanglement. If everything was united in the original singularity at the Big Bang, then everything remains in immediate contact with everything else. All singularities are the same, the identity of indiscernibles, so we're continuing this fundamental point, which is a linchpin for connecting physics and psychology and for understanding the implications of the Psyche equals singularity equation. The singularity of the Big Bang, from which space-time expands, is present at each point of space-time. No matter where an individual observer is in the universe, that observer will perceive him or herself as the central point away from which the fabric of space-time is expanding in every direction at an accelerating rate, culminating in the speed of light at the infinitely hot horizon. I mentioned the infinite heat of the cosmic horizon because infinite heat implies infinite energy, which implies gravitational singularity. A gravitational singularity exists at each point of the encompassing horizon of the universe. From our perspective on Earth, and from our geocentric perspective, it appears to us that we're in the center of an expanding spherical universe. Continuing here, however, observers on a planet located at what we perceive to be the cosmic horizon would perceive themselves to be at the center of the expanding universe and Earth at the horizon. Even from our perspective on Earth, the omnicentric singularity of the Big Bang is present at each point of the cosmic horizon in the sense that the Big Bang echoes back from each point of that enclosing sphere in the form of cosmic microwave background radiation. From the perspective of quantum mechanics, a singularity at the center of a miniature black hole exists at each point of the infinitely dense quantum vacuum that underlies every point of 3D space. So I just reiterated in this slide what I said in the previous slide. Psyche equals singularity, and singularities are everywhere. All singularities are the same. Finally, if the Big Bang exploded from a universal wave function, as Hawking suggests, and if everything was originally united in that wave function, then, in light of the fact of quantum entanglement, each particle in every parallel universe in the megaverse remains in immediate contact, thereby connecting our fate with that of every parallel version of us branching out from our universe at each instant. All psyches are one. Here's a quote from Jesus Christ from the Gospel of St. Matthew, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." That commandment makes a lot more sense if each of us is a gravitational singularity, which would therefore indicate that each of us is one with every other psyche or gravitational singularity. It's not just imploring people to pretend that we're all one. It's a request to recognize the cosmic reality that we are all parts of the Supreme Spirit. So this is from the Gospel of St. Matthew. Someone asked Jesus, "Master, which is the great commandment in the law?" Jesus said unto him, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So the first part of the great law is love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. And the second is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. Why is the second command part of that great commandment like the first? I'm saying it's because God is the omnicentric singularity, and each of us is a subordinate singularity, and according to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, each of us is one. We're all part and parcel of God, absolute parts and parcels. We have all of the qualities of God, but we don't have the same quantity of God. And nevertheless, we're all a point of infinite density. So this is the inconceivability of this concept. The way the Vedanta philosophy explains it is that God is all of us, and God experiences the world through each of us, as well as experiencing the world through his own unique personality, which distills everyone else's perspective into a unique perspective of God's own. God sees with perfect clarity everything everyone else sees, feels, experiences, but each of us can only experience our own unique perspective of things. Even though we're one with all of the other souls, we don't experience what they experience. Maybe in certain extreme situations, souls can do that and have glimpses of God's vision if God allows it, like he did to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita when he was showing him the universal form, as we will discuss later. But for the most part, each of us only knows our own little mind, whereas God knows everybody's mind simultaneously. But if all singularities are one, and if Psyche equals singularity, then it makes sense that first you love God, you love the omnicentric singularity, and then automatically you will therefore love all the other subordinate singularities. All psyches are one and different. Achintya beta beta tattva. Although all psyches are one, we are also all unique, separate personalities engaged in interpersonal relationships. Chaitanya's 16th century Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta. That's what I'll be going over. We've discussed this before. Atman equals Brahman. That's the fundamental equation of Vedic philosophy. Atman is the individual personal soul. Brahman is the impersonal wave in the ocean of impersonal potential spiritual energy. For where an Atman might appear were you to observe it, if we're seeing the parallels between psychology and physics. Each of us is inconceivably, simultaneously, an individual particle of personality, Atman, and impersonal wave in an ocean of precognitive bliss, Brahman. Achintya beta beta tattva, inconceivably, simultaneously one and different. So we are going over the philosophical, spiritual implications of quantum mechanics and general relativity and special relativity at this point in the class. And we've seen how the quantum vacuum is made of miniature black holes underlying every point of three-dimensional space, or in other words, it's made of singularities. Singularities are omnipresent, singularities are omnicentric, and all of them are indistinguishable from all of the others, according to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. So this is the oneness half of the equation of Achintya beta beta. And yet, we're also all different. We will continue to return to this fundamental equation because I think it's the appropriate interpretation of the Psyche equals singularity equation. Omnicentric supersoul, Leibniz and Pascal. 16th century mathematician and theologian Blaise Pascal asks in his book Pensees, do you believe it is impossible for God to be infinite and indivisible? Yes. Very well, I will show you something infinite and indivisible. It is a point moving everywhere at an infinite speed, for it is one and the same everywhere and wholly present in every place. From this natural phenomenon, which previously seemed impossible to you, you should realize that there may be others which you do not yet know. Do not conclude from your apprenticeship that there is nothing left for you to learn, but that you still have an infinite amount to learn. Pensees number 420 in my translation. It's different in other translations, the number in his series of aphorisms. Blaise Pascal is one of the fundamental founders of modern mathematics. He was also a Catholic theologian. And the idea is that God is infinite and yet indivisible. Well, how can God be spread out everywhere and yet not be capable of being divided? At least in your imagination, you could segment an infinite plane into segments. He's saying, okay, well, once you throw in the idea of infinite speed, you can make it possible. A point. A mathematical point has no extension in space, so there's nothing there to divide. A point moving everywhere at an infinite speed, that point would be at each point of everywhere simultaneously because it's moving infinitely fast. Not only would it be at each point simultaneously, but it would accumulate, its presence would accumulate at each point an infinite number of times at each instant. It would be infinitely, intensely everywhere, and yet still you wouldn't be able to divide it. Once you put this idea of a point moving everywhere at an infinite speed in the context of general relativity, you see it is a gravitational singularity. And I am arguing that Psyche equals singularity and that God is the supreme singularity and that we're all subordinate singularities. But you see, this idea is already inherent there in Blaise Pascal. Psychic energy equals mass. Jung's letter to Gebhard Fried, January 17, 1949. This part of the class is going over Jung's speculations about the relationship between psychic energy and mass. He met Einstein several times in 1909 in Switzerland. Einstein was working in Bern, Switzerland. We read earlier that he had his happiest thought while he was working as a patent clerk there. When he was observing workers on a roof across the street, he imagined one falling off the roof and dropping the ball at the same time, and it would be as if the force of gravity was shut off because the ball and the worker would fall toward the ground at the same rate as if the force of gravity had been turned off. So at any rate, Jung is working in Switzerland. Jung is Swiss, he lives in Switzerland, and he had Einstein over for dinner several times, and Einstein himself educated him about the equation E equals mc squared. Later, he would meet Wolfgang Pauli, one of the co-founders of quantum mechanics. So Jung's ideas about the relationship between physics and psychology is coming directly from the most famous physicists of all, Einstein and Wolfgang Pauli. At least Pauli's one of the most famous. Einstein's probably the most famous. So with that context in mind, let's read this letter. Dear Professor Free, many thanks for kindly sending me your recent paper on magic. The question of the subtle body interests me too. I try, as my custom is, to approach the problem from the scientific angle. I start with the formula E equals M, energy equals mass. Energy is not mere quantity, it is always a quantity of something. If we consider the psychic process as an energetic one, we give it mass. This mass must be very small, otherwise it could be demonstrated physically. So I got that quote from a book entitled Encountering Jung. So at first, this is his first speculation, he's saying, okay, the psychic process is an energetic one. If the psyche has energy, it must have mass. Then therefore you must be able to measure the psyche. How come we can't measure the psyche? Well, its mass must be so incredibly tiny that we don't have technology capable of measuring something that small. He's going to change that reasoning in his next letter. The Leap Day letter, Jung's letter to J.R. Smithies, February 29, 1952. So this is the fundamental theory upon which I based my book and upon which this class is based. At the end of this letter, this is the first page, and the next slide will be the next. Jung will come up with his equation. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space, which I translate into psyche equals singularity. In the previous letter, he said maybe the psychic energy has a mass that's so small we can't measure it. Here he's going to say maybe the energy of the psyche is infinite, and because it's infinite, heaviness is equivalent to infinite acceleration, which would irrealize it from the material world. His word, irrealizing. If something is traveling faster than light, it disappears from sight. And maybe the reason you can't measure the psychic energy and the psychic mass is because it's infinite. So let's just begin. The question is, in short, shouldn't we give up the time-space categories altogether when we are dealing with psychic existence? It might be that psyche should be understood as unextended intensity and not as a body moving with time. Unextended intensity is a gravitational singularity. It has no extension in space and it's infinitely intense. So he's writing this letter in the context of Einstein's general theory of relativity. One might assume the psyche gradually rising from minute extensity to infinite intensity, transcending, for instance, the velocity of light and thus irrealizing the body. That would account for the elasticity of space under ESP conditions. If there is no body moving in space, there can be no time either, and that would account for the elasticity of time. Okay, so reading this letter in the context of general relativity is necessary to make sense of it. Going faster than light makes a body disappear from the material world, as we discussed in the slides about special relativity and general relativity. Also, infinite speed is equivalent to infinite gravity. That's general relativity. Acceleration and gravity are equivalent terms. So something that has infinite intensity and is compacted in an unextended point, that's a point of infinite gravity, which is equivalent to a point traveling everywhere infinitely fast, which recalls us to Blaise Pascal's idea of God as a point traveling everywhere infinitely fast. So why can't we measure psychic energy? Because it's a point of infinite intensity, which is equivalent to infinite gravity, which is equivalent to infinite speed, which would make it disappear from the material world. Continuing here in the Leap Day letter, he will certainly object to the paradox of unextended intensity as being a contradictio in adjecto. I quite agree, energy is mass and mass is extended. At all events, a body with a speed higher than that of light vanishes from sight, and one may have all sorts of doubts about what would happen to such a body otherwise. Surely, there would be no means to make sure of its whereabouts or of its existence at all. Its time would be unobservable likewise. So he's saying, I admit the idea of unextended intensity doesn't make sense, but it seems to account for how the psyche can have ESP, is able to understand the past and the future, which Jung himself experienced in his near-death experience of 1944. So he's not mentioning that here, but he certainly has that in his mind because he experienced the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe. At any rate, you see how closely his speculations about psychic energy and why it can't be physically measured mirrors the physics of the gravitational singularity. So this next slide will continue the Leap Day letter. Psyche equals singularity, Leap Day letter continued. All this is certainly highly speculative, in fact, unwarrantably adventurous, but psi phenomena, that symbol of a trident represents PSI psi, that's the parapsychological phenomena, such as synchronicities and clairvoyance and other things that Jung did believe in and claims to have experienced himself, but psi phenomena are equally disconcerting and lay claim to an unusually high jump. Yet any hypothesis is warrantable inasmuch as it explains observable facts and is consistent in itself. In light of this view, the brain might be a transformer station in which the relatively infinite tension or intensity of the psyche proper is transformed into perceptible frequencies or extensions. Conversely, the fading of introspective perception of the body explains itself as due to a gradual psychification, i.e., intensification at the expense of extension. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So there's the fundamental punchline of Jung's Leap Day letter, and that equation can be translated into psyche equals singularity, because the highest intensity possible is infinite, and the smallest space possible is zero. Point of infinite intensity and zero volume, that is a gravitational singularity, and we see Jung wrote this letter in the context of Einstein's general theory of relativity. Jung had been instructed in physics by Einstein himself. So this is what sparked the whole class. Psyche equals singularity. Knowledge of that equation enables us to believe that we are eternal souls serving an omnipotent God on the cosmic stage.
I hope you are enjoying this hero's journey into the realm of philosophy, psychology, and physics. If you want to help me create more content like this, please subscribe and consider sponsoring me here on YouTube. You can also click the link to my website, psycheandsingularity.com, to sign up for a multiple-choice test with over 100 well-crafted questions related to this class, and links to the specific parts of each video where the answers can be found. If you take that test to the end, you will receive a certificate indicating that you have become a Psyche and Singularity scholar. In addition to access to that test, there is also the opportunity to answer essay questions that ask you to relate concepts covered in this class to your own hero's journey. I will personally respond to each of those essays, point out any other parts of this class that I think might bolster your plan. Finally, I want to point out that this course is sponsored by the Platonic Mystery School of the Divine Infinite Being, and you can check those guys out at divineinfinitebeing.com.